All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. So last week we started a conversation, why do things happen? So that was part one, and today we will do part two. And with Purim coming up, we will try and incorporate a couple words of Purim through interweaving it with our discussion today. So today we'll do part two of why things happen. So let's first continue from last week's class and see if we can't bring to some form of conclusion our discussion that we started. So if you weren't here last week, or if you haven't listened to the recording, because I know more people are listening to the recording than live. So if you weren't here last week, we started the discussion of why do things happen. When we say why do things happen in the world, I think that most people mean, why do bad things happen? I have lots of people asking me, why do bad things happen? I have very few people ask me, why do good things happen to me? So when somebody might win the lottery, for example, or finally has a child, or something good happens, very few people have philosophical difficulties understanding why those things happen. The problem seems to be when bad things happen. Okay, so I don't want to be guilty of picking and choosing sides. I don't want to be guilty of that. So I want to talk about why things happen in general, good and bad. And if you're an open-minded and unbiased individual, when something bad happens to you, you'll ask Hashem, why are you doing this to me? And when something extraordinarily good happens to you, you should ask Hashem, why have you done this to me? Or what do you expect from me? Or what's the price? What's the price that you'll extract from me for this benefit? So how do you expect me to respond, God? And therefore, an intelligent, thinking, spiritual person is going to ask why everything happens. So that's our basic agenda. So let's quickly refresh ourselves with what we covered last week to get us back into the mind frame of the subject. We mainly spoke about the fact that we cannot know this. I know that's depressing, and I know that it's sad, but we live in a hidden world. Half of the solution to that is knowing the problem. And although it's painful and leaves us feeling bereft and orphaned, abandoned and distant, nevertheless, that is our situation that we find ourselves in this generation. So another way to put it might be, we're at the bottom of the feet of human history. That's where we're at. The dead, thick skin on the bottom of the feet. So we live in a darkness, and that's called Hester Panim. Hester Panim. Sorry, 1 second. Let me make sure everybody is muted. Okay, so that's called Hester Panim, where God's face is hidden. And it's axiomatic, and that we don't see the spiritual world in our generation, but rather we see it very, very darkly, very faintly compared to the previous generations. And the application of that fact, right, that will bring us back to our subject. What does that mean? It means that we don't know why things happen. So that doesn't mean that we don't know what to do about why things happen. Okay, so let me try and be clear about that. I did not make that distinction last week. I listened to the recording and I did not make that distinction last week. So please don't fire me for that. But I didn't do that last week. So when you ask a question, let's take an example. People say, why did we go through COVID? Okay, right? Why did we go through the COVID crisis? Why did Hashem do that to us? It's very important to distinguish between two very important questions. One question is, why is God doing this? The second question is, what does he want us to respond? Right? So what does he expect from us in this particular circumstance? So those are two separate questions, and it's fundamental to understand that Judaism separates these two questions. And our sources make it very clear to us that we cannot know the answer to the first, but we can answer the second. We cannot know why God is doing this. What I mean is in specific terms, obviously. We obviously know that when there's an epidemic like COVID, that God is not happy with us. That's clear. The Gemara says which categories of sin cause epidemics, which categories of sin cause havoc in the world, and environmental disasters and wars. So the Gemara goes through those. But when you ask for a specific cause, which particular misbehavior of this generation, of the Jews and non-Jewish people equally, caused a particular event, to that we cannot know the answer. Okay, somebody just asked if we can. Okay, yeah. So somebody just asked, where can we find this? So that's a good question. Always source and fact check Borenstein. That's a good thing to do. So where you could find this is in the Gemara in Bava Kama on page 60 on both pages A and B. So and there you'll find a reference to a number of other places. Anyways, therefore we know that God's not do we know why God's not happy with us? Right? Yes. We know that God's not happy with us. Is that surprising to us to know that God's not happy with us? No. Is it hard to see that God's not happy with us? Come on. So what do we see today? Our culture is focused on either money or immorality. As a general rule, that's what our culture is focused on money to spend on immorality, or money to spend on power, or immoral actions for their own sake. So that's the world in which we live. Yes, someone just asked if COVID, yeah, of course. Somebody just asked if COVID is definitely part of the messianic process. Yes, of course it is. But so is everything else. I think it's wrong and immature to start pointing out that COVID is a pre-messianic phenomenon. I don't think that that's correct, just like any other one particular event. I don't think that we can say that. God doesn't speak to us openly anymore. And let me make it clear that the fact that God doesn't speak with us openly is a tragedy and a blessing. It's also a blessing. I'll say that again. When God speaks to you from behind a veil and doesn't make it clear why he's doing whatever it is that he's doing, why he's doing things, you might feel abandoned and at a distance. But it's very important for your safety. When you're working with a small power supply, an old 9-volt battery, there isn't much you can use it to power, but it won't kill you either. The current that battery puts out is entirely safe. When you're working with high tension lines and you've got 10,000 volts and it powers a whole city, right? There's a lot that you can do with that, but if you touch it, you get fried. And there's right, and here's the principle in Jewish history: the closer God is to us, the more we can achieve spiritually, but the more responsible we also are. So that's the principle. When the Jewish people make an error, when King David makes an error, a hair's breadth of an error, when the sons of Aaron make a hair's breadth of an error, very well motivated, but there's 1 centimeter of error in their judgment, they get fried, right? Instantaneously. And that's the rule. When we step back from God in disobedience, he steps away from us. It isn't only because we cause the distance, it's also a safety. The further he is away from us, the safer we are. The less voltage we have, the less alive we are spiritually as well, but the safer we are. It's very important to know that. And therefore, there's a very important consequence. In our generation, where God is further than he's ever been before, we have 2 benefits. Benefit number 1 is it's safer. It's safer. Much less is expected of you when God isn't looking over your shoulder and manifesting his presence. And secondly, you can achieve more in another way. In the darkness, you get to create. When God's light is shining in a blindingly bright fashion, what's your candle worth? But when you live in darkness, your minuscule candle can create a great light. And that's the secret of the oral law. When God steps back and stops manifesting the written law, we get to create and write the oral law. That's the greatness and that's the purpose of the generations who live in darkness. So those are the benefits. Okay, so let's bring ourselves back to our immediate subject. So the bottom line is, when things happen, all I've done so far is try to expand and explain better what we began studying last week. Bottom line, when something happens to the community and something happens in your life, we don't know why, except for the rare circumstances that I mentioned last week. An exception would be something very, very specific, very specific. So you do something and it's connected. This generation, we don't know. And therefore, like we said last week, you give a broad spectrum antibiotic. 1 second. You give a broad spectrum antibiotic. And that broad spectrum antibiotic in the spiritual world is what? It's studying Torah. It's studying Torah. On rare occasions, God talks to you. So let me say this more broadly. Okay? God speaks to you in two ways. More openly and less openly. The general way he speaks to you openly is read your life carefully. Daven for something sincerely and see the result. Let's bring this into Purim, because we have Purim coming up this next week, right? Write a Megillah of your life. What's the Megillah? It's Migaleh. Migaleh. It reveals. When you take one incident in the Megillah, it says nothing. The king makes a decree against the Jews, right? It happens all the time. Haman comes to power and wants to kill all the Jews. Happens in every generation. They'd all like to kill us, by and large. There's a girl who happens to be a Jew in a position of power. No one knows that she's Jewish. Okay, that could happen. The king can't sleep one night. That could happen too. Haman comes to ask the king for permission to kill all the Jews. Nothing miraculous about that. But when you put them together and you see the clockwork mechanism of how this happened at exactly the same moment, that happens, and each instant in the Megillah leads to the next, the whole thing miraculously fits together. And if you have the eyes to see that, what you need to do is you need to write a Megillah of your life. Right? How many people here in our group, or if you're listening to the recording 10, 20, 30 years ago, how many of you could have dreamt that you could have the access to Jewish Torah material at the level that you do today? Who of us knew of the opportunities that Hashem has given us in our lives? You need to write a Megillah in order to see that. You won't see it from moment to moment, but as you see the events linking together, you'll see the chain forming. The point of the whole Megillah of Purim is that there are no open miracles. But when you link all the incidences together, it couldn't be any clearer. That's one way in which God speaks to us. No more clear openness today. And if you look close enough through your own Megillah, then you can see. And secondly, on rare occasions, you may see a direct message. After all, God can function in the darkness, but there can be occasional flashes of light. Again, that doesn't break the rule, but it has to be very specific. Not some imaginative story why this is connected to that. Not talking about that. We're talking about when the message is crystal clear. And you know this is the reason. And there's no doubt in your mind. That's an amazing privilege when something like that happens. He's privileged you with a direct kiss. That's how you should view that. He's pulled back the curtain. What do I mean by that? I'll give you an example. A while ago, one of my rabbis was dealing with a young woman who was inexplicably ill. She was a young person. She was in her late teens, maybe 18 years old, and she became very ill and eventually became bedridden. And it was very, very peculiar. The doctors involved were very confused and said that the test didn't make any sense to them. So there was no clear diagnosis, and there was nothing clearly abnormal, so she was just wasting away and getting weaker and weaker. The doctors weren't able to make a diagnosis to help her. Eventually, the situation began to look desperate, and one day the mom walked in to see this particular rabbi of mine, and she says, I know why this is happening to me. She didn't ask the rabbi why this is happening. She told him, I know why this is happening. She said 15 years ago, she had an abortion. I was not particularly religious at the time. My husband and I decided that we didn't want children at that time, right? It was a little girl that we aborted. And every night since then, for the last 15 years, that little girl comes to me in a dream and she cries. And I know that I know what God is saying to me. He's saying, you didn't want one? Then I'm going to take one away. Okay, now that wasn't a lady who went to my rabbi to ask why things were happening. She knew clearly, right? This is what she had done, and this is the consequence. This is the consequence. She wasn't asking him for advice. To her, it was a very clear message. A very clear message. If you're as convinced as that, and you feel it very clearly, then you may legitimately get the message. That's possible. Perhaps you'd like to hear what happened at the end of that particular story. I'll tell you. My rabbi was unable to advise her. He tried teshuva and tefillah. He tried all the common remedies, but nothing spoke to her. So he went to see the great Ramosha Shapiro, and he told him the story. And Ramosha Shapiro, again, the great rabbi of that generation. So my rabbi asked him, what do I tell her? I've tried this and I've tried that. Nothing has touched home with her. Nothing's resonated with her. So listen to what Ramosha said. Listen to the mind of Ramosha. He said, go back and tell her, this lady happened to be an extremely wealthy person from a fabulously wealthy family. So he told my rabbi, go back and tell this lady to go find a young woman, a young Jewish girl who's about to have an abortion, and pay her not to. And then, not only that, pay her to go through the pregnancy, and then when the child is born, this lady must pay for this baby to be adopted by a Jewish family and pay all the child's expenses. Now, let's just get this clear. First of all, unfortunately, there are many Jewish girls who have abortions. First of all, it's unfortunate that anybody has abortions. But again, this can be a traumatic event for the rest of her life. First of all, we aren't talking about the sin and the spiritual damage that's done in the world when an unnecessary abortion takes place. That's one problem. The second is this girl's going to feel guilt potentially for the rest of her life, right? So look what you're achieving. You take a young girl like that, you pay her so she can go through the pregnancy, give her whatever she needs and the child to be born. You eliminate that element of guilt. You eliminate the sin and spiritual damage of the abortion. And secondly, Jewish families who are looking to adopt Jewish children, it's so hard to find Jewish children who are up for adoption. It's very unusual to find Jewish children available for adoption. Right? There are many reasons for that. So here you'll have a Jewish family adopt a Jewish child and show this child a wonderful life. Right? So look how many bases you've covered. And this woman will feel that she undid, hopefully, the spiritual damage. She's taken the responsibility to make what we call a tikkun, to make a measure-for-measure tikkun. As it happened, at the time when this incident occurred, my rabbi had a friend who was a gynecologist and dealt with young women and issues like this on a pretty semi-regular basis. And this Jewish gynecologist's wife, she happened to run an adoption agency. And all my rabbi needed to do was go back to the lady and tell her that. And that lady, the mom of that 15-year-old girl, that lady, she sailed out of the room. She floated. As the story goes, this woman did all of those things. And her daughter, although it took a long time, she did recover. Okay, so now you see the mind of Ramosha Shapiro. So he did that a lot. He would make a very intentional connection for tikkun, measure for measure. How can you counterbalance? Okay, anyway, principle number 1. All we've done is expand on the idea that we began last week, that we cannot know why things happen specifically. Now we come to the Ramchal. The Ramchal in the second section of Derech Hashem, in the 3rd chapter, discusses Hashgacha Pratis, or as he calls it, Hashgacha Ishis, right, which is individual providence. How Hashem deals with individuals in the world. And he gives an analysis. A fantastic detailed chapter analyzing why things happen in the world in general. And he covers 12 bases. 12. And as far as I can ascertain from the discussion, he means them to be exhaustive. In other words, he's got the confidence to tell you these are all the reasons why all things happen in the world. That's outstanding. But again, be that as it may, he goes through a list of reasons why things happen in the world. So let's start dealing with them specifically one by one. So the first and most general of reasons why things happen, and let's put it in the context of bad and difficult things. Okay, bad or difficult things. Difficult things happen, or something painful happens, but more broadly, why do things happen? Reward and punishment, we touched on that last week. Yes, in Judaism, we do believe in reward and punishment. And I would put it more generally in Jewish terms as consequences. Consequences. As all of you know, the deepest reward for a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. It's the spiritual benefit and elevation of the mitzvah. The benefit to the world, the benefit to the person performing the mitzvah. Punishment, it's not some extraneous punishment. It's the pain and harm that you've caused. And of course, the punishment is meant to be corrective. Think about Hashem's mechanism of tikkun. Sin causes damage. Damage causes pain. An ongoing collateral damage in the world. Eventually, that comes around and it hurts you. How much does it hurt you? Exactly as much as the damage you caused. Why? Because that's exactly as much pain as you need to suffer to fix the original problem, which was the deficiency and insensitivity in character that led to that amount of damage. What goes around comes around is another way we say it. Or some people might call it karma. So here's the mechanism. Again, a person has a certain flaw in character. And because of that, they cause pain in the world. Right? Insensitivity, damage, vulgarity, or pain, or damage in a relationship. How much damage have you caused? Exactly in proportion to the deficiency and fault in your character. Obviously, again, the fault in character, the problem in your spiritual makeup is what led to the damage. It's a product of the problem of your personality. I hope I'm being clear here. And therefore, it's that amount that is caused. How much does that harm the world? Exactly in proportion to what you've done. How much pain will you feel as a consequence? Exactly that amount of pain. Because all you will feel is the pain of the damage that you caused. And that's exactly the amount of pain that you'll need in order to fix the problem. Why? Because it's measure for measure for measure for measure for measure. And it all comes home to roost. And that's exactly the way it works. And so punishment is a consequence. What's reward, by the way? What's reward? Reward is a consequence of what you've done. You built a world. A long time ago, I think that we may have talked about this, right? I think that we may have talked about how can the reward be more than the work? So let me give you one avenue of insight into that. The spiritual work of a mitzvah in the world is to become a vessel. Become a vessel. To build a vessel to become a receiver, to make the world able to receive the benefit of the bounty. And that is a request for Hashem's blessing to flow in. To flow in. An eye for an eye, but Myrna, as you know, obviously an eye for an eye is not taken literally in that context, but sure, why not put it that way? Okay, so again, what's flowing into that vessel, right? What's flowing in can be infinite. You've made a vessel. Now we have a separate question, which is, aren't your vessels always finite? Aren't vessels always finite? That needs discussion. But that's clearly what's happening over here. You're not supposed to be bringing the blessing into the world. You're supposed to be making your vessel. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Making your vessel. Do you want a beautiful dugma for this? A beautiful source for this? When the great prophet Elisha was traveling and he was approached by the woman who was in extreme circumstances, there was no money left. The creditors were coming to take away her children. And she said to the great prophet, "What should I do?" Again, she was a widow with no source of income. He said to her, "What do you have in your house?" She said, "I've got a bottle of oil." He said, "Okay, that's good. Let's use that. Take your bottle of oil and go and borrow vessels from all of your neighbors, jars, containers, borrow anything that you get your hands on." So the lady went around and borrowed all the jars and vessels that she could get. Right? She ended up with many of them. He closed the door and said, "Let's start pouring the oil." So she pours, she fills the vessel, she continues to pour, and the oil miraculously continues to pour. Finally, when they're all filled, she says, "Please bring me another vessel." And the kids said, "There aren't any more vessels." And the oil stopped. And then when she told the prophet what happened, he said, "Good, go sell the oil and you'll have enough to live on. Take care of all your debts and you and your children can live on the rest." The question here that the Kabbalists ask is, why did he ask her what she had to start with? Why did he ask her that? He's going to perform a miracle for the lady. Click your fingers, Mr. Prophet, and make money. You want olive oil? Make olive oil. You want vessels? Make the vessels. Again, you're going to perform a miracle. Mr. Prophet, why are you asking me what I have in my home? So this is a revealed miracle at the hands of a prophet. Oil would be produced miraculously, far in excess of its original amount. Why do you have to start with a flask of oil? Why do you have to bring vessels? If you can manufacture the oil, manufacture the vessels. Do we all hear the question? So the answer is this. There's no problem with the oil. The problem is with your vessels. You don't have to pour the bounty. Hashem is always waiting. The shefa is always coming down. Hashem is always waiting to pour it out. Always. The faucet is ready to be opened. The question is, where's your bucket? That's the problem. And therefore, the concept of reward is manufacture the vessel. If you hollow out the vessel, once the vessel's been hollowed out, Hashem is only waiting to fill it up. Don't you want to give your child or children as much as possible when you see that they're ready to receive it? When you want to give your child money and right, as many opportunities as possible? But it has to be on condition that you see that they can use it wisely. Again, they have to be able to use it wisely. There's no problem with his ability to give. The problem is your ability to receive. That's our concept. Again, reward in this world, the work in this world. By the way, if you ask me a practical question, how do you hollow out your vessel? The answer is you take out your ego. Take out the ego. That's always what's obstructing. That's what's filling your vessel at the moment. If you can take out the ego and lose all sense of pride, then you become a completely empty vessel. Who's the greatest human? Who's the greatest human being in the world who held the most content ever? Moses. He also happened to be the humblest. Since he had emptied his cosmic-sized personality of cosmic ego, he was left cosmically empty. And the cosmos were then able to fill him. Okay, that's reward. Now, punishment is exactly the amount you cause. Reward is vastly more than what you did. Why? Because your work in the world is to become a vessel for infinity. And therefore you can be filled with infinite bounty. So in summary, this isn't a full lecture on reward and punishment. This is just scratching the surface. But the first category is reward and punishment. That's the first that he lists for reasons of things in the world. So let's move on to the second. The second, let me just catch up on a couple of questions before we move on to the second. No, for sure, if somebody's a product of trauma, right, no, so that's something else. We're not talking about that. If somebody has no idea what they're doing, that's obviously not what we're discussing. Right, that's not what we're discussing here. Okay, so the second is what we call Nisayon. Nisayon, which is an ordeal. Things that happen to test you in the world. Of course, everything is a test. Reward is also a test. How will you handle it? Punishment is also a test. Will you understand that it's a punishment and take it as a correction? Or will you get angry and become resentful and need more sensitization? Of course, again, these aren't mutually exclusive answers. Everything is a test. However, the next one is called Nisayon, ordeals. Things happen in the world to test you. Again, you'll be put into situations of difficulty, of pain, suffering, bounty, and benefit. All a test. Some people are given money, not as a reward, by the way, but as a test. Great riches, not as a reward, exclusively as a test. Because great riches are a very serious test. Probably more than great poverty. People are given great wealth. Quite often, it's a recipe for destruction. Both wealth and poverty are both great ordeals. King Solomon prayed, and he said, please Hashem, don't give me poverty and don't give me wealth. Give me what I need. That's amazing. Hashem didn't necessarily observe his prayer, by the way. Hashem did give him great wealth. That's another issue. But listen to his prayer. He says, poverty and wealth do not give me. Give me bread according to what I need. A sensible person does not pray for wealth. Are you sure you can handle it? A sensible person prays for what they need. Now, some people need much more, and some people need less. If you have more needs, or you're supporting a foundation, whatever it might be, but if you have more needs, you can pray for them. We aren't talking about limiting, but why would you ask God for more than what you need? That's a recipe for disaster. Again, you might need a lot, and that's fine. If you genuinely need it, ask for more. So the Ramchal says the next reason why things happen is a test, which means a person could be hit with some sort of tragedy or pain because they did something wrong, but because they have the potential to grow from it. A person can be given enormous bounty, suddenly unexpected, tremendous blessing, some incredible opportunity for wealth, not because they deserve it, but because there's a test in there to see how they'll utilize it. One of the tests for wealth, for example, is to know how to share it. When I say share, I don't mean simply giving it away. I don't mean that. But what good can you generate with your wealth? What can you build with your wealth? Now, why would God test people in the first place? That's not our subject. Sorry, let me catch up on a couple of comments over here. Okay. Okay, that's a good question. Is there a limit to what we can ask for in terms of spiritual wisdom? The answer to that is no. You may ask for all of the spiritual wisdom without limit, because spiritual wisdom is God consciousness. No limit. You can ask as aggressively as you want. When you ask for spiritual tools are here to help do his work in the world. And if you enjoy them as well, that's fantastic. That's not a problem if you enjoy it as well. If you work very hard to build a love relationship with someone and build a genuine love, is the fact that you'll enjoy it as well a deficiency? Right? Is that a detraction? No, it's totally fine. Not only is it fine, it's probably essential. The Rambam actually says people are tested in order to become spiritual teachers. I'll say that again. The Rambam, he says that people are tested, the reason being in order for them to become spiritual teachers. Rambam says that God tests people to make them teachers. He puts Abraham through 10 public ordeals so that the world can see how to cope and how to grow. God tests his righteous individuals to make them spiritual teachers. I don't know what's going on with Putin, but I'm safe. I'm pretty confident in saying that I don't think he's a spiritual giant. That's all I'll say. But again, God puts Abraham through the 10 public ordeals so that the world can see how to cope and how to grow. He tests his great righteous individuals in order to make them spiritual teachers. That's what the Rambam says. And by the way, if you look through the Rambam's list of 10 ordeals that Abraham suffered, you'll notice that they're all public. Not everyone agrees with Rambam. Rashi has a different opinion about what his 10 tests were. But the Rambam lists 10 tests that were all public. God isn't testing a person because he wants to see what the person is capable of. God tests a person because you need to know, right? Because you need to know what he's capable of. When you see a human being rise to that level, what happens? You become inspired. And that's why he does it, right? The Rambam takes a totally different view. That's Rashi. The Rambam says God tests people not because other people need to know, not because God needs to know, but because you need to know what you are capable of. Each person. And that's why the Rambam and Rashi list ordeals of Abraham, again, also that were private. For example, God telling him that his children would be enslaved, and him having to deal with that news. God, him being hidden, by the way, in a pit for many, many years because Nimrod wanted to kill him. So these are things that were private and not revealed to the public. Because the Rambam's opinion is that the tests are not only to turn you into a spiritual teacher, but to also bring your potential into actuality. So the second category, again, without going into detail, is ordeal. That's the next category. Third category. Sometimes God does things to you to help you reach your perfection. He does things to help you get to your perfection. For example, a person does an action that's good. They start a project that is mitzvah related. They start a project, God helps them in that direction. He may give you a rocket-powered boost in that direction. You show the desire, you get the help. When you work for a company and you show initiative in the company and you have a new initiative and you start working on it, your boss and your managers, they'll pour money into you. What kind of boss or CEO wouldn't back a worker whose initiative is showing promise and going places? The rule of spiritual balance means that if you start going and doing bad things, God will help you do that too. Or rather, he may. The Ramchal will go on to say that sometimes when you go on to do something bad, God might block you because the world doesn't need that sort of damage. And sometimes when you go to do something good, God might block you also because he's testing you. So again, these are complex factors. Later, the Ramchal tells you how to calculate the complexity of these problems. So let's take one thing at a time. This is called siyata dishmaya, which means divine help. You start in one direction. You start a project to help visit sick people, to make their lives better. And as you start the project, someone gives you a donation that completely amplifies what it is that you're able to do. You can also become motivated to do something which would lead people to sin or to do bad things. Both ways, God can give you a boost and say, be my guest. He's amplifying your activity in the world. It cuts both ways. Can't only have it for the good. If every time someone tried something good and everything always worked out for that person doing good, and God blocks everyone trying to do bad, nobody would have free will. Not too many people would misbehave after seeing that enough times. So it happens on both sides of the aisle. You start something good, you get help. You start something bad, you get help. So this needs discussion and obviously a full analysis. I'll just bring out one point here. This should be perplexing everyone. Let's say you do something good. Two consequences are possible. You can be carried along in that direction, or you can be blocked. You try to do something good, okay? God is testing your sincerity. Really? You want to help poor people? You want to help sick people? Let's see how keen you are when it isn't easy. When you suffer humiliation or pain, let's see how serious you are about this effort. So a good deed could be assisted or it could be blocked. Bad side, somebody tries to do a sin. God could prevent them for certain reasons. Marriage from the past, other people he wants to block. Or he could say, be my guest, go right ahead. You want to do that? I'll help you get worse. You started it. And you bring down my energy into the world through your will and activity. And if you use it for the bad, you'll be helped in that direction as well. If you're listening carefully, you'll realize that when something happens to you and there's a response and you're either blocked or assisted, you never know if it's for the good or the bad. You never know. Let me say that again. It's a very important point. You try to do a certain thing in the world. You make a decision. You think it's a good thing to do or the right thing to do. Or you're in doubt about the activity, but you decide that that's the way to go. And suddenly you get a blockage. Let me ask you a question. Is God telling you that he doesn't want this from you? Or is he testing you to see it if you want it so bad, you'll work as hard as you need to work to make it happen? You don't know. You don't know. Okay, let's try the opposite. You do something bad and God blocks you. Is this because it's in fact something bad and you're being protected? And that magically is a special gift from above? Or perhaps this thing isn't so bad. Let me make this as clear as I can. You choose a direction in the world. You may find yourself helped or hindered. You can't read the sign. Okay, let me say that again. Let's take a classic case. You decide to do something good. It could be good. It could be a life decision. You decide to study a certain course or go to a certain school or whatever it might be. Take a certain job, start a certain Torah-related activity, whatever it might be. Two things can happen. Two things. You can find difficulty placed in your way. You can find assistance on your path. Don't read the signs. Don't interpret what you do as good or bad because of the response. Interpret what you do as good or bad because you know it's good or bad. I once had a Kabbalistic teacher who used to say, Siyata Dishmaya is no raya. Help from heaven is no proof. Help from heaven may be a sign showing you're doing something right. It might be a sign from heaven allowing you to self-destruct. And therefore, here's what you do. When you make a decision in the world, you make it based on Das Torah. Is this the right thing to do because the Torah wants you to do this? guided by your Torah wisdom. If it's the right thing to do, go for it. Now you've got difficulties in your way? Okay, assess your agenda and the difficulties in Torah light. That's all you have to do. If it's clear that it's something that needs to be done, and you're the person to do it, and it's clearly mitzvah related, and Hashem puts difficulties in your way, then you push on. You push through that. Why? Because the Torah analysis has told you that this is the right thing to do. It's that simple. A friend of yours needs help, and you're the only one who can help her, and it's met with humiliation and challenge. Does that mean that you give up? No, of course not. Try harder. Don't read the result to teach you that what you're doing is either right or wrong. Read whether you're right or wrong by analyzing the situation, again, your genuine motivations, and through your genuine insight. Then you'll know whether you're right or wrong. Okay, I know that we've only gone through 3 or 4 of these, and I know we're not going to get through all 12. But as I've always learned, it's better to lean more towards quality versus quantity. So anyways, I'll leave you all with this story. There was a very emotional chuppah, right, where people were getting married. Under the chuppah, there was a rabbi under the chuppah with the couple, and the young man took the ring, right? Obviously an electric moment. He's about to put the ring on the girl's finger. Everyone is hushed, and the ring fell down to the floor. A few times, again and again and again, he tries to put the ring on, and it falls to the floor. Keeps happening. And he kept picking it up, and the ring kept on dropping. Again, a very tense moment came over the crowd, and people started saying, this clearly isn't meant to be. It's bizarre. He drops the ring 3 times. Have you ever seen that happen? The ring falls at the critical moment. It must be that Hashem is telling us that this marriage is not meant to be. What else could God be telling us? Obviously, both the bride and the groom were extremely anxious at that moment. The parents are now looking at each other. And the rabbi said, pick it up. Do it again. Put the ring on the finger. So he picked it up, picked up the ring, and now he's holding it, and the rabbi says, put it on her finger. The 4th time, with great trembling hands, the chatan, the groom, put the ring on his kala's finger, and they were married. After the chuppah, people came to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, excuse me, the ring fell 3 times. Weren't you concerned that this was a sign from heaven? And the rabbi said, no. Every spiritual event happens at the right time. The time hadn't come around yet. It wasn't the right time yet for this marriage. There were little delays until it was the right time. Get married, it's the right thing to do. The ring falls, all of a sudden everybody in the world at that wedding became a great Kabbalist and knew the reason. Unbelievable how that happens. No, it's a mitzvah and it needs to be done. So you do the mitzvah. Careful how you interpret the signs. The wrong interpretation is God doesn't want the marriage to take place. The correct interpretation is there were 3 separate 30-second delays, and then it was the right time to get married. You interpret what you're doing by virtue of what it is, not by hysterically and superstitiously reading things that aren't actually going on. I'll give you one final example. Rabbi Yaakov Hillel wrote a book called Tamim Tihiyah. Rabbi Yaakov Hillel was a rabbi raised in England, and his family originated from India. A fascinating Kabbalist. His book, Tamim Tihiyah, which means be trusting in God, right? Don't get superstitious. And it's a book analyzing speaking to the dead and bones in the mouth and all these voodoo techniques and what is not allowed in Judaism. What's not allowed in Judaism. The book has about 13 haskamas, or people who wrote their approval for the book. 13 of the great minds of the last generation, all saying that you need to read this book. Why? Because we live in a generation of complete and total superstition. People will go to, you see those people, in front of a house that's painted, and right down the block from where we live, there's a bright pink house that it says Egyptian witchcraft and, all that stuff. People read your tea leaves and your ground coffee or whatever people read nowadays. So anyway, we live in a generation of superstition. Today, owning a thing with a hand hanging on your wall, or owning a set of the Zohar, is magically more important than performing mitzvahs. Again, that's completely ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. My rabbi once asked for Moshe Shapiro about a segula, a kosher segula. And I remember my rabbi told me, he told my rabbi, why don't you just go and hang up a horse? So my rabbi didn't ask Rav Shapiro about segulas after that. So again, we're in a superstitious generation. Don't get caught up in all the signs and palm readings. Get caught up in Torah and mitzvahs, right? And solid Das Torah. Proper analysis, reading things for what they are. Okay, I think that's a good place to end. I want to wish you all a wonderful Shabbat and a wonderful Purim next week. And maybe next week we'll talk a little bit more about Purim. Anyways, thank you guys all so much. Shabbat Shalom.